When we become believers, we have a lot of questions, and I'm hoping I can answer a few questions today in the short length of time, not many. But there were a couple guys, they were sitting in a diner. And this one guy said to the other guy, he said, let's make a plan, let's make a deal. We'll make a bet. And he says, I'll ask myself a question, and if I can answer my question, then you buy me a Coke. And then, though you can ask yourself a question, and if you can answer your question, well, I'll buy you a Coke. And the guy says, that's crazy. I've never heard of such a bet like that. He said, no, let's try it. We'll try it. It'll be okay. He says, since it's my idea, I'll go first. He says, and my question is, if a rabbit digs a hole in the ground, why doesn't he throw all the mud and all the dirt up all over himself? And my answer to my question is, because he starts at the bottom of the hole. And the other guy says, that's crazy. He says, how can he do that? He says, I don't know, that's your question. So I have a few questions for you of my own. First of all, how many of you remember your grandfather? Raise your hand if you remember your grandfather. How many of you remember your great-grandfather? A few of you, not quite as many. And how many of you could tell me where your great-grandfather is buried? A few of you. Well, the point is this. It won't be many generations, and we're all going to be forgotten. Sorry. That's just a fact. The Bible says, it says, teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts to wisdom. So I want to talk a little bit about wisdom today. And Psalm 103 says, as for man, his days are like grass. As the flower of the field, so he flourishes. But the wind passes over it, and it is gone. And its place remembers it no more. Now, as Jerry said, you've heard that I've written a book. And you might be wondering, is that because I want to be remembered a little longer? No, I have no illusions. But what I do want is I want to have an influence on this generation. I want to have an influence on you people, this generation. When I was a little girl, I loved Daily Vacation Bible School. And I loved the stories, and of course you remember our favorites about David and Goliath, and about Daniel in the lion's den, and the three Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. And remember the little song some of you older ones might remember, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. You guys remember that at all? Dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. And you know, my heart would burn within me. I wanted to be a Daniel, dare to be a Daniel. Now I knew that I was probably not going to end up in any lion's den, and I was probably going to not end up hopefully in a fiery furnace. But this is one thing I did know, that their God was my God, and he was still alive, and he does exciting exploits in the lives of people who are totally committed to him. And that's what I wanted. And now the last few weeks, my verse has been from Psalm 145:4. One generation shall praise your works to another and declare your mighty acts. And this is my prayer, Psalm 71. O God, you have taught me from my youth, and to this day I declare your wondrous works. And now also, when I am old and gray-headed with a little bit of, weave in my hair. Now when I am old and gray-headed, O God, do not forsake me until I declare your strength to this generation, your power to everyone who is to come. And so my heart and my desire is to pass the baton to pass the faith along. Remember, you kids, when they had that little video at Sandy Am where Kim was running? Do you remember that? When she had the baton and they played the song, Passing the Faith Along. I promise I won't try to sing that one. But they did the song, Passing the Faith Along. Well, that's what we want to do. Pass the faith along to the next generation. I want to ask you something. What is the most precarious time in a relay? What is it? The handoff. And if they drop the baton, are they going to win the race? Probably not. And if the baton is dropped and it's not picked up, there will be no winning for the next generations. And that's my concern. And my concern is for you guys, but I want you to realize that unless you pick up the faith and pass it on to your next generations, it's going to be a pretty scary time. I think we're living in scary times. In fact, I think you might be living when actually you might be facing fiery furnace. We could well be living in those last days, and we don't know what it's going to look like. But it was March of 1965. We had been married in March of 1960. So we've been married for 5 years. And in that 5 years, if you multiply 5 times 52, you get 260 Sundays. And in that 260 Sundays, we had gone to church twice. And I don't need to tell you that my walk with the Lord was pretty much gone. It was pretty much nil. And in those 5 years, there would be times when I would be, the only thing I can call it is lonesome for God. My life would be, just wouldn't have the purpose and meaning. And I knew the plan of salvation. When I was a kid, I loved to share Jesus. And I memorized those verses. Then I could lead somebody else to the Lord with Scripture. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. And of course, John 1:12, but as many as received him, to them he gave the privilege, the right to become children of God. And of course, I knew especially Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anybody will open the door, I will come in and have fellowship. And I would get lonesome for that fellowship. And so I would work through those verses, and I would repent again, and I would ask for that renewed fellowship again. But I would never tell Donnie. I didn't want to tell him because you guys know him. You know, the golden retriever. He had more patience and gentleness without the Lord than I did with the Lord. And I wasn't going to tell him until I got kind of saintly. He might find me reading my Bible or being spiritual. The only problem was I didn't read my Bible. And I didn't find a church. And it was very soon that all this had just kind of dissipated. So, like I say, it was March 1965, and dear Sister Grandma Eloise had conveniently left a book, and it was called Beyond Ourselves by Catherine Marshall. So I picked up that book and was reading in it, and I think it was about the 2nd or 3rd chapter. It talked about what she called a prayer of relinquishment. It was a prayer when you've tried everything and nothing's worked, and you finally say, okay, God, I give up. Here it is. I can't do this. You'll have to do that. And I thought, well, that's pretty much where I was. Nothing had worked. And so I was going to try this prayer of relinquishment. And I says, okay, God, if you exist, no, I don't. I believe there's a creator. I don't believe in evolution. I can't believe I believe there's a God. There's a creator. Okay, Jesus, if you can hear my prayer, and if you want my life, and then I thought, he might not want my life. I really screwed up pretty major in those 5 years not walking with him. But I thought, okay, here's my prayer. This was the sum total of my prayer. Jesus, if you want my life, you can have it. But I don't have any faith. And I knew also the verse, Ephesians 2:8, for by grace are you saved through faith. And so I figured it was my faith that would save me. And I knew that by this time trying and it not working, I wasn't even sure if I believed any of it anymore. So I told him, if you want my life, you can have it. But I don't have any faith. So I got up from that room, where I was, and I walked into out that door. Donnie came in for lunch. He was there on the farm, and I'd fix him soup and sandwich or something. He'd come in, eat real quick, and go back out. So when I left that room where I'd been reading that book, I knew something had happened. No bells, no whistles, but it was just different. I knew something had happened, and I knew two things. Number one, I had to tell Donnie. And number two, I had to find a church. I knew it would not work, but it was on my brain, those two things. So he came in for lunch. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. So he left, and again, God, I told you I didn't have any faith. You'll have to tell me what to say. And so all that afternoon, I remember thinking, now how's God going to show me where to go to church? Write it pink in the sky, help me drive my car. And then I think, oh, Carol, can you believe any of this is real? Let's not be melodramatic here. And I remember thinking, now, if he hasn't shown me by Sunday, I'll get the kids ready and I'll go out to Peoria Road, and will I go north or will I go south? But I remember, I had no idea how this was going to work. Well, and each time I would remind them, because that faith would, kind of leave me. I don't know if you understand when you just think, do I believe this? And I say, I told you, God, I didn't have any faith. And that was the only way I got to talk to God for weeks, is just say, God, I told you I don't have any faith. You'll have to do this. So this was on Wednesday in March. The next day, Thursday, Donnie came in. And he says, Carol, that little church down there in Peoria, no, well, it's just off the road there. You've seen the sign in the store, haven't you? No, I never stopped there. And he says, well, there's a sign in the store, and there's some people in the community, and that little church has been closed for 12 years, but they want to open it. And my grandparents went there, and Sunday is their first Sunday, and I want to go. Whoa. Hello, God. It was like having God in the line. So I thought, okay, what am I going to tell them? And I was not going to tell him, quote, I'm a Christian. But what I did say was, Donnie, I told God yesterday, if he wants my life, he can have it. So we went down that little church. I was there for Sunday school, a little group of about 8 of us around, and I shared what God had done for me just that Wednesday. And when I did, Roger Smith, who was the American Sunday School Union missionary, got tears in his eyes. And when I saw that, I got tears in my eyes. And I knew I was home. This was my church. And of course, that was Peoria, and you guys know the history of that. Well, Donnie's testimony was somewhat similar. He prayed the sinner's prayer and asked forgiveness and so on, and was baptized, and Pastor Hayes had us come forward to make our public confession. But it was a year later. Do you guys remember his testimony of this? He told it over and over, and I'm going to tell it again for him. But his story was this. We were at the Hayeses, and Mrs. Hayes was leading a Bible study, and we did not remember what she asked us to pray. But at the end of that, she asked us to pray a silent prayer. And on the way home, he told me what he had prayed. He says, Carol, I told God I wanted him to take my life. I wanted him to take my business, my dairy, my farm, and everything. And then he said this, if I ever go away from this commitment, I want you to take everything from me. Because I would rather lose everything than lose this relationship with you. Now, why am I telling you that story? Some of you kids probably have heard it before, but the point is this. In our little lives, we made what I would call total commitment. We gave the Lord everything. Romans 12:1 says, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. And it's kind of his death for our life. And there's a place I just read this week in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says, there will come a time and they will say to him, but we said, Lord, Lord. But he says, depart from me, I never knew you. So when it's not enough just to say Lord, but we need to let him be Lord. And what is Lord? It's boss, isn't it? If he's Lord of our lives, then he's boss. Now, have you ever wished that you lived in a perfect world? What would a perfect world look like? Well, probably, first of all, chocolate will have no calories, right? Or at least it would be considered a vegetable. And I thought in a perfect world, women would have the first baby, men would have the second baby, men would have the third, men would have the women first, then men, then women, and then we'd probably only have 3 kids. But, well, that might look like a perfect world. I saw a little cartoon in Dr. Glenn's office one time, and it said, if you put a crouton on the top of your hot fudge sundae, you can call it a salad. Don't you love that? But we don't live in a perfect world. Stuff happens. Sometimes it's really painful. Stuff happens in our lives. And by March of 2017, I had written all this exciting, faith-building events in our lives that God had done. But I also knew if I was going to be honest, if my book was going to be authentic, I had to share some really hard stuff that come into my heart. And I want to tell you that there was some information and discovery that came into my life that totally broke my heart. I was crushed. I was pulverized. And that was hard stuff to write about. But you know, I don't want to, and I didn't want my book to imply that if we are believers and totally committed to the Lord, that we're some kind of little cosmic pets and nothing difficult ever happens to us, because that's not true. That's not honest, is it? And so I had to write about my failure, my failures, my heartbreak. And I don't need to go into it today, but I want to just tell you that that's part of being a committed Christian. You're going to have some tough things. But you know, it's called the trial of your faith. And faith that's not tried, we don't even know if it's real faith, do we? Until our faith is tried. But here's what I also want to tell you, that God does not want to waste our pain. And sometimes those painful times in our lives become the most significant times in our story. When and people say, well, time is a great healer. Well, I want to tell you, time does not heal anything. But in time, if we trust Jesus, trust the Lord, then the healer can come in and bring healing and can bring purpose and meaning to our lives. So that was part of my story, and I had to write about that, and I have to be honest and authentic. There were many failures, many shortcomings in my life, but God was still my life. In fact, my mother was worried when she heard about this discovery. She was afraid I would turn away from the Lord, being so disappointed. But you know, I never had a thought turning away from the Lord. In fact, I told him, God, I'm probably the worst player on the team, but you're stuck with me. I'm not going anywhere. You got to see me through. And that's the way it was. So as I thought about what I wanted to share with you guys today, I have to tell you I wrote a couple of messages. And, in this period of time, you can't share too much. Jerry told me I couldn't go too long because he says some of us older people might need our little potty breaks. So I would try, so I knew I couldn't go too long. But I thought I want to share with you wisdom. I want to, wisdom about family and kids and marriage, and wisdom about finances, and then the Lord impressed on me the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And if we don't have the fear of the Lord, we haven't even begun. And so what is the fear of the Lord? You ask somebody and they say, well, you don't have to be afraid of God. You just have to have respect for God. Well, that's part of it. But I'm here to tell you that to know the fear of the Lord, you've got to know your God. That's what you need to know. You need to know Him. So I'm going to go through a few little attributes of God. These are things you all know, I'm sure. What does it mean when I say God is omnipotent? Omnipotent. What does it mean? Power. He's powerful. He's potent. He's all powerful. Incredibly potent. What if I say He's omniscient? Omniscience. He knows everything. You guys, He not only knows about the universe, clear down to the DNA and the germs in our bodies, but He knows all about us. Psalm 139 says He knows when we rise up and when we sit down. And He knows our thoughts from afar. He knows the words even before they're on our tongue. Now that's a little scary. But the point is He knows all about us. And if I say He's omnipresent, what does that mean?
Everywhere.
Everywhere present. And Psalm 139 says there's no place that we can go out of the presence of God. And now another attribute that we can talk about all day is He's a God of love. We can't even comprehend the depth of His love and mercy for us. So that's another very important attribute. But one that we sometimes kind of forget is our God is holy. We sing, holy, holy, holy. He's righteous. Now, if I would give you guys a test, I gave you a little piece of paper, and if I had you turn that over and I wanted you to write out those 5 attributes of God, I know every one of you could write them. Maybe not spell the whole omniscient correctly, but you would know those. You would know those attributes of God up here. But how many of you walk every day in an awareness that God's presence is with you? There's a Psalm 34, one of the first Psalms I memorized, and it says, "Come, my children, listen to me, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord." So we have to learn, we have to be taught the fear of the Lord to get this in our hearts and minds. And the only way to do that is to come to the very Word of God. And we need to practice. By the way, if I sent you, I said, I'm going to teach you how to play basketball, and I told you how to dribble, and expected you to go out there and play well in a basketball game, how well would you do? You'd embarrass yourself. Thank you very much. I would. Yeah, we have to practice. And you have, come, my children, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord. You have to practice it. You have to tell yourself in the morning, I'm going to remember that God is present with me every day. And in that same psalm, it says, here's what it says. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ear is open to their cry. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. So, yes, God's eyes are on us. When we moved to, first built our little house there on Peoria Road, Pat Keene, do you remember the little plaque she gave us? The little tiny plaque she gave us. And it said, God is watching you. And then in the little letters it says, because He loves you so much, He can't take His eyes off you. Well, it was just a little plaque, and I was decorating my house and ready to put a little plaque. I had to put it in a little room, and so I put it in our little guest bathroom. And Rob was there one time, and she came out and she says, "Carol, that's a little disconcerting to be sitting there in the bathroom and look up and say, God is watching you." Probably not the best place to put that, but that is the fear of the Lord, knowing that God's eyes are on us every moment, and it's incredible protection. If you know God is with you, there's nowhere you can go from His presence, and He knows all about you, and He loves you. Wow, that should deal with a lot of the fear we might have otherwise, wouldn't it? So, He loves us, He's omnipresent, He's all powerful, but He's holy and righteous. Once upon a time, there was a judge. And this judge was known for his integrity. This guy was a righteous judge. And you've seen the little statue of, justice with the blindfold on. No partiality, no prejudice. He was fair and righteous. But he also had a son that he loved very, very much. And one day his son came in before his bench. And he was guilty. There was no question about it. He was guilty of the crime. And the punishment required life. Now here's this judge. He was a man of integrity and righteousness. Could he say, well, I've always been fair and right. I'm going to let this kid by? Could he do that? Not remain a man of integrity. He couldn't, could he? But on the other hand, he loved his son so much. And what could he do? Just say, you did the crime, you pay the time. What could he do? This was a dilemma. And so to maintain his integrity, his righteousness, he had to say, son, the law says, the day that you sin, you shall surely die. But then he got up, he took off his robe, laid it aside, and went down and stood by his son. But I will pay the price in your place. The law says a life was required, and it's going to be mine. And you see, that's the position, that's the dilemma God was on. And we hear and we praise and we, hallelujah, we see the cross, and what do we think? Well, we think how much He loved us. But we forget that not only did Christ die because He loved us, but He loved the Father. And the only way the Father could forgive you and for me was for somebody else to pay our price. And of course, that's what Jesus did on the cross. Now, Jesus desires that we would come, kneel at the cross, and say what He said in the garden, not my will, but thine be done. Here's my life. You do with your life, my life, as you please. But we also know that we have a right. I call it a sacred right to freedom that God has given us. And we don't have to do that, do we? We can say, no, I'm going to live my own life. Nobody else is going to tell me what to do. It's my life. And do you know what God says? You're absolutely right. Your will be done. And so that is the picture of what God has done for us. And we need to come with that total commitment. And I know some of you kids are probably saying, we just want us to be little fanatics. And guess what? I do. I don't want you to be weird. That's not what it means to be weird. And I don't expect you to be a preacher like Papa was, or some kind of missionary. God needs His butcher, baker, and candlestick maker, doesn't He? But He wants people who are totally committed to Him so they can see the meaning and purpose and power in their lives. And here's my husband, Arthur. Now, Arthur wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a missionary, but very young, he gave his life totally to God. And he was a businessman. And with his life, he influenced and impacted many people for Jesus. He was able to lead them to the Lord, and he's heard stories about how their lives have gone on and influenced other people. And so that's what I want to tell you. We all have an influence. And you guys are going to, each one of you is going to influence people that I don't know. And you're going to influence people that these people don't know. We all have, I like to call it a sphere of responsibility. Those that we will influence. And that's what I want for you guys. I want you to pick up the baton and know Jesus and be prepared to pass your faith along to the next generation. In fact, we're all writing our own obituaries. That's a little depressing, but I guess at my age, so maybe I can think of those things. When I say Nobel, what do you think of when I say Nobel? Huh? Yeah, the Nobel Peace Prize. And the guy who established that was a man named Alfred Nobel. And he lived at 36 to something like 1896. And he had several brothers, and one day his brother Ludwig died. And so Alfred picked up the newspaper. He wanted to see what Ludwig's obituary, what was in his obituary. He opened it up, and the line was, the merchant, excuse me, the merchant of death is dead. And it went on, and it talked about various armaments that were invented, but it talked especially about dynamite. And all the people who had been maimed and killed through this new invention. And Alfred realized that was not Ludwig's obituary. That was his obituary. The guy had thought it was Alfred who had died instead of Ludwig. And he thought, oh my goodness. And that is when he had never married, didn't have any kids, and he took his wealth, and he was a very wealthy man at this time, and he established all his wealth for an endowment, and that's where the Nobel Peace Prize is funded to this day. So, when Donnie died, it fell on me to design a tombstone. And of course, it would have our name, and it has his name. It's already got my name on it. It's kind of weird. And of course, it has the year of his birth, and the year of his death, and the year of my birth, and a dash. And then, eventually, the year of my death. Now, what do you put on a little tombstone? What can you write on that? Well, we had talked quite a bit about finishing well. And we knew people of our contemporaries who had started out well in their walk with the Lord, but they had ended up not so well. You know, they'd just kind of gone away from the Lord in their testimony. And of course, there's people in the Bible, a number of them, who started out well and didn't finish well. We know Jehoshaphat didn't finish that well, and we know King Saul, he finished really lousy. And of course, Solomon didn't finish all that great, did he? So anyway, we talked about we wanted to finish well. I even have a little article in my file about finishing well. So I decided I would write on this tombstone, he finished well. And I told my girls, when I die, they can decide, because I told the engraver to leave a little room in front of the H to put a T, and after the E to put a Y. And when I die, they can decide if Mom finished well. And if I do, they can put the T in the Y, and it will say they finished well. Now, if I don't finish well, that's going to look, you know. He finished well, what happened to her? Chopped liver, huh? So, that's kind of haunted me. But you know, you might say, is that why I've written a book? No. No, people. Anybody can write a book. Of course, getting it published is a pain in the you-know-what, but anyway, you can. Anybody can write a book, and that does not mean that you have finished well. So what does it look like to finish well? Well, I've talked a little bit about wisdom, and I wanted to pass on wisdom to you, wisdom about the fear of the Lord and walking in an awareness of that. So here's what James has to say about wisdom, okay? Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. And of course we know Galatians 5 tells us about the fruit of the Spirit. And of course we can say the first three. What are they? What is it? Joy, peace. But the next 6 are a little harder. And of course the first one is long-suffering, which means patient. But that's what I want to be true in my life at the end, that I represent some wisdom and that I walk in the fruit of the Spirit. Now, I want to close with one more little story, okay? There was a blind girl who hated herself purely for the fact that she was blind. In fact, the only person she didn't hate was her loving boyfriend, as he was always there for her. She said if she could only see the world, she would marry him. One day, someone donated a pair of eyes, and now she could see everything, including her boyfriend. Her boyfriend asked her, "Now that you can see the world, will you marry me?" The girl was shocked when she saw that her boyfriend was blind too, and she wouldn't marry him. Her boyfriend walked away in tears and later wrote her a letter to her saying, "Just take care of my eyes, dear." Kind of hits you in a lot of ways, doesn't it? Just take care of my eyes, dear. Jesus died in our place. He gave his life in death that we might have life to live for him. And of course, again, we have questions, don't we? We have the question, what are we going to do with that life? And again, it's our sacred right. We can choose. And we can always choose what we're going to do about a lot of things. But we don't get to choose the consequences, do we? There are a lot of choices we can make, but we don't get to choose the consequences. So I want to challenge you this morning to think through your heart. What do you want to do with this one life that you have? We always hear, only one life will soon be passed. Only what's done for Christ will last. But I want you to, I'm going to give you in a minute here, I'm going to give us some time for silent prayer. And I'm going to ask each one of us to get before the Lord and make a decision what we want to do with our life. I have to tell you that I remind the Lord almost every day, Lord, again, I say to you, this little life of mine is yours. You can do with it today whatever you please. So, and you know what? It's not how much faith you have, is it? He says if we have faith like a grain of mustard seed, it can do incredible things. But the question is, what are you going to do with that faith? You know, if that little seed, have you ever seen that little necklace? That seed will never produce a tree. No, we have to plant it. It has to be put in the ground, and we have to put it into Jesus. So the question is, I challenge you this morning is, what will you do? Like the boyfriend who gave his eyes that she might see. The Lord gave us his life that we might live. He says, I have come that you might have life and that you have abundantly. So let's just take a minute. I want everybody to just close your eyes and close yourself in before the Lord. And he's asking you, what are you going to do with your days? What are you going to do with your life? And you know, before I leave, and this is my last chance, you know, I have this pulpit. No, I do want to make a final warning to you, or a counsel, I would say. Don't be like I was in those 5 years, not willing to tell anybody that I have made a commitment or that I have made a recommitment. You know, we need to speak it with our mouth as well as believe it in our heart if we're going to be transformed. So I challenge you, I plead with you, if you've made any kind of commitment or recommitment to Lord, tell somebody. If it's just your spouse or whoever, you know, I reminded God again this morning that he can have my life. And then if you're not involved in the church, I challenge you to get involved in one and be faithful to attend, because you can't do this alone. And those were the two things that I knew on that day in March of 1965 that I had to do. I had to tell Donnie. And all I told him was, you know, I wouldn't tell him I was a big Christian, but that I'd given my life to God. And then I plugged into a church, and you know that that church has changed my life. So that's my challenge for you today. Thank you for being here.